BC has the highest cost producing fiber in all of North America. It is a lot of bureaucracy where to get cutting permits, it may take 2 to 3 years, where by comparison in other regions, what comes to mind is Alberta, Quebec, Ontario potentially, is maybe 6 months. So we have to look at the bureaucracy. We have lost more than 60 mills since the 120 that we had, probably around 2000. Hello, my name is John Brink. I'm the founder, CEO of the Brink group of companies, which have a number of companies. And this particular podcast is in regards to the forest industry. I'm also a lumber manufacturer, a value-added lumber manufacturer, which means I don't do primary or whole logs, but we rather use lumber as an input and make other products up the value chain. I've been in business for 50 years this month in the industry, and this is a session of BC forest industry in crisis. And even more so than I've done in other segments of the BC forest industry in crisis. This one is probably, I would suggest, of all the time that I've been in the industry, 50 years as an operator, and 10 years before that as working in the forest industry in British Columbia, I would say it is the most challenging time that I've ever seen in that 60 years. Partially because of forest policy in Canada and in British Columbia, the other one obviously relating to the United States, which is the main market for our lumber products, but also because of tariffs that most people are familiar with, and that is part of the U.S. government policy under President Trump, but also in regards to softwood lumber duties, which is duties that are charged on lumber entering the U.S. market and are deemed to be subsidized by the U.S. Softwood Lumber Coalition. So I will address most of those issues, and then first and foremost, the one for all those people watching us, the forest industry in British Columbia is unique. And for all those people flying in and around British Columbia from here and other places, the first conclusion you would come to is the amazing amount of forest that we have in British Columbia. And then saying, what is happening to the forest industry that has been here since the late 30s, 1940s and forward, and became an amazing industry around the province, the coast, the interior, and employed 100,000 plus individuals in all kinds of jobs and careers in all the communities on the coast and in the interior of British Columbia. So what has happened in particular the last 10, 20 years in particular, where it became a forest industry in transition? Partially because of nature is what comes to mind is that, again, looking at, in order to put this into perspective, the coast forest industry is different than the interior. So Hope northward, more than 2/3 of the province would be considered the interior of the province. The species are different than the coast. The coast is mainly Douglas fir, cedar, and hemlock to a certain extent, and those are different species used for different products. Even that part of the industry has substantially become much smaller than it was before. In the interior is mainly SPF spruce, pine, and Douglas fir, and balsam fir rather, and so that part of the industry started to have encountering difficulties in early 1920s when pine beetle, which represented about 1/3 of the species in the interior, were affected by the pine beetle. The pine beetle took in particular liking to pine species and virtually destroyed most of those species in the interior. It started all with a blowdown in around Burns Lake in a park, and because it was a park, they couldn't really deal with it and had to kind of watch it as it then grew and it became a huge proportion. Probably over the years, I would say that probably 1 billion cubic meters of pine beetle, representing probably 25% at least of the forest in the interior of British Columbia, was affected by it and was harvested and expedited to save as much of the usable, economically viable pine available. So most of the sawmills operating during 2000 in particular for the next 10, 15, 20 years wound up the value in the mill's production value, and the annual allowable cut in the province and in the interior collectively likely went from an average of 50 million cubic meters annually to somewhere in the area of 80 million cubic meters annually to deal with the issues of pine beetle. We already knew then fairly quickly thereafter, as the usability of the pine was not any more viable because of the quality and didn't produce any more products other than waste in a lot of cases, or chips for that matter. And so the annual allowable cut in the province was reduced because of that issue and returned more to the area of about 60 million cubic meters annually and below that. Other things that happened, in particular in the last 5-6 years in particular, and beyond that actually, the industry in British Columbia has had traditionally, coming all the way from the 40s to the 50s and the 60s and onward, mainly primary manufacturing. But that means is making mainly commodity items like 2x4, 2x6, 2x8, 2x10, 2x12, 8 to 20 foot, dimension products that were mainly aimed at the U.S. market. Over the last 60, 70, 80 years, there always has been pressure from U.S. producers of lumber that too much of the lumber was coming in from other areas, in particular Canada and in particular BC, where there was an allegation of subsidy in terms of the cost of timber to those mills, affecting pricing of lumber in the U.S. In particular, in the 1980s, duties were put into effect on, or an attempt was to limit by volume the amount made available to the U.S. That was not acceptable to the Canadian and BC producers, and so duty was put into place for a period of about 10 years or so. And then from there on in, it continued until more recently, in particular 2017, when another set of negotiations in regards to access to the U.S. market, duties were put into place of 14.5% duties. The challenge was that Brink and others being value-added manufacturers, that add more social and economic value to the resource, mainly lumber as an input, not timber, but at one point in the 90s and 80s were charged duties on the input value of the lumber, not the output. Let me give you an example. If it costs $100 to buy lumber input to a mill, secondary manufacturing, we make all kinds of products from it throughout the province in Canada, then the price of the duty would be charged on the input volume, but in value, but not on the export. If you added $800 or $900 in value, $100 cost of the input, and you added here $800 or $900 in value, then the price of duties would go from, rather than 14.5% or 14% or whatever it is on the $100 to the output, and it just take much imagination, that was penalizing. And the effect of that in 2017 in particular was that a lot of the value-added manufacturers that had been in business were no longer viable, and gradually those companies disappeared. The next thing was obviously more pressure, and because of access to timber for the primary sector. Those are the sawmills. And a lot of the sawmills are consolidated into a number of large operations, like Canfor comes to mind, West Fraser, Tulco, and a number of other ones in the province that are consolidated big organizations who had a lot of sawmills. In the province of British Columbia, we have had up to 2000, we had about 120 sawmills. Today, because of all the things that have happened in between, and mainly relating to economic viability of access to fiber, we are down to half that. And a lot of the companies have shut down, and the loss of jobs. And so what happened? Well, economic viability, it was not, in my opinion, lack of fiber, even not today. But if we look at northern BC in particular, to communities like Fort Nelson, Fort St. John's, Mackenzie, Bear Lake, Fraser Lake, Vanderhoof, Houston, mills that were there at the cost of thousands and thousands of jobs have been lost when those sawmills that were there shut down, and remain to be shut down. And so what is the reason other than duties and other reasons? Tariffs comes to mind. To put it into perspective, why are we not doing more would be a reasonable answer. But what should the industry look like? Why can countries like Sweden, that basically have the same land mass in regards to the forest region, is about the same, or usable forest regions are about the same as BC, but have a very successful primary sector and secondary sector who were having the same challenges as we had in the past, but changed the direction of forest policy and did more intense management of the forest. What is the difference between them and us looking forward? And what did they do to change it around about 20, 30 years ago? They started to have more intense forestry and tending to the forest, sometimes up to once, twice, three times in a cycle. And it's the growth cycle, not undifferent necessarily from us here, could be 40, 50, 60 years, 70 years, depending on what area they were growing in, but that's what they would do. As a result of that, the annual available timber volume virtually doubled from around 40 at one point to where they want as high as 80 to now where they have over 100 million cubic meters of timber available. And they have just the opposite issue with us, not enough primary capacity and too much timber in a way. But the key has been changing the makeup of primary manufacturing. And for me, it always has been a model. The first thing that when I came here in 1965, there's no money really, but it's the dream of building a lumber mill. Worked in a sawmill here, first as a cleaner man, then a lumber piler. The amazing thing, and already from my experience in Holland, where I grew up in an area where my dad was managing a lumber company, and the one thing that we did not do, you would not step on a piece of lumber. If you did, you better run because you would get a boot in the back end because you didn't do that. You respect the fiber. When I was here looking at burners and seeing all that wood going up the burner, I could not believe it. Probably more than 50% of the tree would go up the burner, and the rest would go into dimension products. So where do we go from here in terms of, do we have enough timber here in British Columbia? A lot of people say, no, there is not enough timber. There is, because the official annual allowable cut calculated by government is somewhere in the vicinity of 60 million cubic meters annually. Obviously, that's about what we need. Then the objective of government is to cut, or the annual allowable cut objective to access is 45 million cubic meters. My question is, why? What happened to the other 20 million? Why are we not making that available? Because the calculations say the availability is 65 million cubic meters, and the objective is 45 million. Is the one number wrong and the other one is maybe right, or what is it? We need to know in a coherent way as to why. Of the 45 million cubic meters that government wants to make available, of the 65 that could be made available, is we're only using or making available of that 45 in the last year is something like 30 million cubic meters. Less than half of what could be available. Why? That's a good question. Why? Government manages these areas, and what comes to mind with all my friends in government, BC has the highest cost producing fiber in all of North America, by far. It is a lot of bureaucracy where to get cutting permits. It may take 2 to 3 years, where by comparison in other regions, what comes to mind is Alberta, Quebec, Ontario potentially, is maybe 6 months. So, and all of that adds to cost. And obviously the other changes that have taken place, and I'm supporting that, First Nations will get up to 20% of the AAC. And so, which I support, but then becomes a question of, okay, so we have to look at the bureaucracy. What are we doing compared to others, and how can we, again, while the industry is departing us from central British Columbia, we have lost more than 60 mills since the 120 that we had, probably around 2000. And how can we attract capital to build new mills, especially not if we are the highest cost producers of fiber, mainly because of bureaucracy or other obstacles that make the wood cost so much higher. What do we do with it? How do we go about it? And so the other part is, what should the industry look like? Now, I'm an advocate of adding more value to our fiber. Amazingly, a lot of people say that a lot of the primary mills that used to operate here, companies like Canfor, West Fraser, Talco to a certain extent, Interfor, and all the other ones, left the province substantially to go and set up operations in the U.S. Southeast, mainly southern yellow pine. And that basically goes into the U.S. market and saying, okay, what is the difference between, and thinking in particular in northern interior, what's the difference between SPF, spruce, pines, balsam fir, and between that and southern yellow pine? Well, southern yellow pine, probably the growth cycle is 30 to 40 years, if that. It tends to be very hard, very difficult to work with. The two species are distinctly different. With all due respect, I usually say you have to drill it before you nail it. The other part that you will see with that wood, if you have it sitting in your yard in a package, you can't leave it too long because you get too much twist and crook. It doesn't tolerate time. So our species, I'm not saying that it's not suitable for some areas, but it certainly does not compare to the easy working with SPF versus southern yellow pine. The two are no comparison in terms of quality. So add to that other opportunities that we have in the marketplace. Are we looking at other places other than North America or the United States in particular? We're looking potentially at areas like Japan. So what does Japan mainly look for in terms of species like ours? They like SPF, but they only buy the highest quality for the products that they make. They will not be building houses like we do. And a lot of times the industry goes out and government is supporting it and setting up offices, have for years and years, both in Japan, looking for building houses like we do here in Canada. It's not going to happen. They only are interested in a certain segment of the lumber that we manufacture, the high grades. China is a good example. They are, again, distinctly interested in our low grades, the bottom 25%. So what I'm saying to the government and to industry as a whole, and to the people that are so affected by all the jobs. The jobs in the industry have gone from in excess of 100,000 jobs to less than 50. What do we do to change the industry? I say change first and foremost the bureaucracy around the forest industry in terms of making timber available. The annual allowable cut by government's calculations are 65 million cubic meters annually. The objective of government, for some reason that is not clear to me, is to deliver 45 million cubic meters. And last year, we only did 30 million cubic meters. So there are distinct issues and problems. Why does it 2 to 3 years to get cutting permits? And why is our cost so high? So how can we now, which we must as we go forward, how do we attract investment in a new forest industry that is making new products for new markets, that has a model in my mind, I've been advocating for many, many years, is that we need first and foremost, bureaucracy that is sensitive to all the things that we get so caught up in bureaucracy that it is extremely difficult to be economically viable, to plan forward, and all those things. We have to be much, much more sensitive to the obvious things in terms of bureaucracy. So then attract investment in primary manufacturing, meaning we have skill sets available, and I can do a podcast about that one alone, but not today. But we have to make sure that skill sets are available. is that we need innovative primary. That likely means more technology, employing less people, in combination with intensive secondary, which means adding more value to at least, if you have a lumber mill producing 100% of the products, the top 25% should be set aside for value-added manufacturing, and the bottom 25% should be available for value manufacturing. And rather than, which government tends to do, together with government or industry organizations like COFI, the BC Lumber Trade Council, which are focused on something that used to be 20 years ago, but are certainly not looking forward, in my opinion, as to where we can be and should be, is saying that how do we attract companies not only in the primary sector but also in the secondary sector. Rather than looking all over the world and trying to find secondary manufacturers, which we did in China and other places, open your door. Look into the interior of British Columbia. We have people available and communities available to do secondary manufacturing. Rather than looking all over the world trying to find places, open the door. Look outside. Look at the communities like Fort Nelson, Mackenzie, Bear Lake, and Prince George, Zwaarderhoef, and on and on and on in the interior, but also throughout the province. I believe we are not effective in doing that. Those are the parts that I believe in the industry where we have the opportunity as taking this amazing province with this amazing timber that we have in the province, some of the best quality in the world, no question about that, and we have the volume available throughout the world. And so then let's have a discussion about duties. Already a number of years ago in the early 80s, when duties became a problem, we had organizations like the BC Council Value-Added Wood Processors was very active. I was the founding president of that, and we negotiated together with the federal government and the U.S. government that secondary manufacturers, the allegation has been by industry in the United States, the U.S. Softwood Lumber Coalition, obviously their objective, with all due respect to my friends in the United States, is that if they can create a shortage, supply and demand set prices, that the less lumber comes from Canada, the higher the prices will be for them. And I respect that, but we have not been effective negotiators. We did at points then where for secondary manufacturing, we would only charge, as I said earlier, on the input, not the output. So what do we do, and what will it look like, and where are we now? So since 2017, again, the negotiations with the United States probably, although government in the United States, and particularly the President of the United States, believes that they have enough lumber available to them in the United States. In my opinion, they simply don't. Even now, housing starts in the United States are somewhere around 1.2 million. If it should be where it has to be, and it's normally around the 1.5 million, going as high as 1.6 or 1.8. They're probably short on lumber they have to bring in from outside of the United States between 30 and 40%. That's what it is. And we all know that. So the opportunity is there, and that means the viability is there. But for us, in British Columbia, we have to be aware of that. We have to take a look at industry. How does it function? How does it work? And how do we become more efficient? And so therefore, I believe what we have to do today on duties alone, we are paying close to 35% duties, 35% on duties. A company like Brink that has been in business for 50 years now. It's a medium-sized secondary manufacturer, no handouts, no subsidies. We have paid between $70 and $80 million in duties because of the allegations of subsidy mainly for timber. We don't have timber. We don't use timber. We're just using lumber as an input, competing with our friends in the United States for the same wood for upgrading it. Why? Simply because government, both provincial and federal government, and industry, in particular in the industry organizations, did not include the notion of exempting secondary manufacturers, or if at all being charged for subsidies they didn't receive or got, that they should be excluded or pay on the input. They didn't include that in the negotiations. Subsequently, of the 800 companies that we used to have, secondary manufacturers, we have less than 25% remaining. Northern BC alone, at 42, 45 secondary manufacturers, now probably there are a half a dozen, and probably 3 or 4 of those if they were not here, if they could get out. So we pay 35% in duties alone. In addition to that, today, with all the uncertainty around it for both primary, secondary, and communities, we may also be charged tariffs collectively. May it be 10, 15, 20, 25, 35%. So it could well be that the 35% that we have to pay in duties, add to that another 25% would make it 60%. How do you suspect? How can anybody operate like that? How can anybody invest? Now, governments, with all due respect to the federal government, has decided to take a tough approach. I agree with that. And as far as the forest industry, have decided to make $1.2 billion available to the lumber sector in particular, of which $700 million would be to support operating lines potentially for companies that have difficulty, and $500 million for investment in making new products for new markets. All of that I can encourage. If we look at 10 provinces, then $1.2 billion would be relatively minor, although I say that respectfully. It probably is missing 1 zero in my mind. But if we want to be serious about it, and I say that respectfully, the other challenge with that potentially is that the Americans and the U.S. Softwood Lumber Coalition will say, oh, that's subsidy. So let's start on more duties again. What we could do is the approach should be, and I take Brink as an example, but there are many others, secondary manufacturers in particular, that have paid duties. Duties are different from tariffs. Tariffs go in the big sinkhole in the United States, and Trump will say, oh, I got trillions of dollars and blah, blah, blah. That doesn't apply to duties are set in escrow of some sort or another that is still available to us. It's our money sitting there collecting interest, and we should be able to get it back if we negotiate correctly at the right time. The right time is now. And a lot of companies have, I believe it is up to 10 or $11 billion in duties that have been paid. That should go back to those companies, and I believe the federal government could justify in challenging situations, in particular as it applies to secondary manufacturers, to make loans available based on the amount of duties they paid, and still will come back to us, subject to the federal government negotiating with the Americans and saying, no, because there is no agreement at this point in regards to duties. The duty money should come back to companies like ourselves that are paying it and should not have been paying it. And it's not then looking at subsidy. So that is the one area. So then saying, how do we go forward here in BC in particular, but also in Canada? But it's lacking, with all due respect, I love Canada, I love BC, I love all the things about it. I'm frustrated with forest policy and policy, period, is that lack of economic fiber, availability in the province will deter investment in the forest industry of larger capital coming in. The next thing at risk is it's only a matter of time until the mid-size companies that still are in the regions in particular will likely shut down or close unless we do something about it. Constructively, we have to address the issue of bureaucracy. Why are we the most expensive province in North America in access to fiber? Why do we have 65 million cubic meters available, and the goal is to make 45 million cubic meters available, and then of the 30, we only make available 30. And companies have to wait 2 to 3 years for cutting permits. That's not acceptable. The other part is that let's stimulate secondary manufacturing rather than sending all the fiber wherever you want to send it. Open the door. Look outside. There is entrepreneurs that have commitments to this province in terms of further manufacturing. Brink, for the last 50 years, was employing up to about 6 months ago, 8 months ago, a year ago, 400 employees. No handouts, no subsidies, no timber. In Prince George, in Vanderhoof, and in Houston. We want to do more of that. But we cannot do it, if the incentives that are being created are not only not helpful, but are instead harmful. It's a government, and that's one of the challenges that we have of democratic rule, likely, is that every 4 years we have an election, and we may go to the left or to the right, whoever is in, and then they appoint ministers of different portfolios, and in our case, Minister of Forest. And usually the Minister of Forest that is being appointed has no experience, so they have to go through the whole exercise of learning. And I say that with respect to the current Minister of Forest, Ravi Parmar, amazing individual, has been very, very ambitious, very, very hardworking. But the fact is that he has no experience, and he then tends to, with all respect, listen mainly to the big companies, and particularly in organizations like COFI and BC Lumber Trade Council that have been the problem, not the solution, and usually follow rules set out by the biggest payers, and common sense only indicates who that are. So collectively, I say there are lots of opportunities in the province of British Columbia, lots of opportunities in Canada, and lots of opportunities in North America. We have to make, rather than spending a lot of money setting up offices around the world to convince people to build houses like we do, and more or less force them into buying our products, do the spaghetti, I call it, is find what do they need and what do they want, and then say, how can we produce that in our communities and create entrepreneurship to make new products for new markets and create an incentive, rather than have companies where entrepreneurs, including Brink and many others, have spent their lives trying to build a future in communities and find themselves being, through ill-conceived policies, forced into a position where it is simply not viable. And even those people at some point will say, I throw in the towel. I'm not going to do that. I'm here, I'm going to stay here, and I say, what do we do as a government? We must plan forward. Regardless if we have a right-wing or left-wing government, the timber in the province of British Columbia is controlled by you, the people, And so, different than Sweden, where most of the forest is private. There's probably a case to be made of that as the mixture of it in terms of how effective can management be. I don't think it takes much imagination that government here, no matter if it was this government or the one before, but the other ones have not been effective in doing that, so we must change that in some form. What that looks like, I'm not sure, but it has to be changed. And so, and then plan forward as probably a vehicle of what policies should we have as we go forward that is not subjected to left wing, right wing, and all other things, but saying we have to have forest policy that goes forward 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years and saying what should it look like? A potency have forest companies and communities like Fort Nelson, Fort St. John, Bear Lake, Mackenzie, and I can go on and on and on. Let's have companies there, primary, secondary, working with First Nations. The time is now. If not now, then when? And if not you, this government here, either federally in regards to duties and negotiations on tariffs, if not now, if we don't take a strong position as a federal government, as a provincial government, if not now, then when? And if not you, then who? Before everything is caving in. There are opportunities for First Nations, for communities, but it is your timber. You must become proactive. You must look at what are the reasons and why, or even more importantly, why not. The facts are that there is huge opportunity in a new industry, meaning innovative primary in combination with intensive secondary, where we manufacture products that the market in the world wants and needs. We have the best quality of fiber in the world, right here in this province and in the interior. We have the entrepreneurship like people like me that have spent 50, 60 years every day looking at what can we do, how can we go further, how do we become successful. All of that is available to us, but we must have a strategic plan in terms of access to fiber. You cannot have viable secondaries unless you have a viable primary sector. And there must be capital involved because everything takes a lot of capital. But right now, we're paralyzed. And a lot of it is our own doing. We have available in this province, by the government's calculation, 65 million cubic meters of fiber for manufacturing. Our goal is apparently to harvest 45 million. My question is, why? Why not 65? And which number is wrong if this is the objective? And why, of the 40, if it were 45, why only are we doing last year 30 million cubic meters, which is less than half of what is available? And why does it take 2 to 3 years to get cutting permits, where in other jurisdictions we do it in 6? And at what point are we going to look at our bureaucracy and saying, if we want to be successful in this new global market, which it is, and if we want to be successful in our arguments with the United States needs our lumber. There is no question about it. That does not mean that we not have to find other markets, but the time has come now. And that's my message to government. I'm not being critical. I'm simply saying, after watching this for 60 years, being in operation for 50, we still are not attending to the underlying issue. You must have a strategic plan of moving forward, regardless on what government is in British Columbia. And that means the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And we have to stay with that plan, and that means, in my opinion, intensive primary in combination with secondary manufacturing. Either buy those companies or attracting capital, I believe, and then being sensitive to training and job training and all of those things in combination, we are in the best location in the world for access to market. Obviously, I sound somewhat frustrated, and I must admit I am, in a way, because if you see the opportunities, and for all those people watching this podcast, that is a solo from me in regards to the lumber industry in British Columbia, at least for all my friends from around the world that are watching my podcast, this is one that involves a very, very important part of my involvement. I grew up to be in lumber. It's my passion. And I love British Columbia. I love Canada. And I believe we have a huge, huge location and a huge opportunity. And I get frustrated sometimes by, or not only sometimes, now in particular, as to why with all the riches that we have, somebody would stand on the sidelines and look at what we have, location, quality, people, all those things. It would take genius to screw it up, but apparently we've been close to doing that, and we can't. There is still opportunity, but we have to become much more serious about it, develop a long-term strategic plan, and opportunity is here for those that want to invest, because I believe that we will change direction and we have huge opportunity. The U.S. market cannot operate without us in a normal situation, but at the same time, we have to find markets for our products in other places. Manufacture what they need and want, not what we want them to buy from us. We just happen to manufacture. So hopefully this will give people in a general sense a better idea of what's happening in the industry from my perspective. Thank you very much for watching it.